Joss was his friend, a misguided, stake-carrying threat to Vlad's life friend, but still. Besides doing anything out of the ordinary might clue Joss into Vlad's unusual dining habits. His shoes finally tied, Vlad plucked the Lucas from atop his dresser and crept out of his bedroom into the library. There was a line of light coming from under Nellie's bedroom door. He closed his door behind him and was 2 steps from the top of the stairs when Amenti darted from the darkness and swatted his ankle. Vlad whispered harshly, "Amenti, stop that." Amenti gave him another good whack with her paw before darting down the stairs. Vlad looked at Nellie's door. There was no way she hadn't heard Amenti's fat body thumping down the stairs like that. But she didn't open her door. Vlad crept quietly down the stairs and out the front door. One of these days, Nellie would catch him sneaking out, and he'd be grounded for an eternity. Outside, the moon had painted the ground blue and the trees an eerie, lifeless gray. It was warm enough for Vlad to forego his jacket, but by the time he reached downtown, Vlad wished he brought it anyway. There was something oddly comforting about heavy denim against your skin, and comfort was one thing he wasn't finding on his walk to the cemetery. He hadn't made this walk in an entire year, but he'd repeated the same trip 3 times now, once a year on the anniversary of the accident. He tried coming during the day, but there were always people about, so instead, Vlad chose to pay his respects just a few minutes after midnight so that he and his parents could spend some time alone, reminiscing about better times so that no one would be there to see Vlad cry. Casting glances over his shoulder every few seconds to be certain neither Eddie Bow nor Joss were following him, Vlad made his way to the edge of town and stopped just in front of the cemetery gates. His short brick walls sat at either side of the entrance, and twisted black wrought iron arched over the dirt path that led inside. At the top of the arch, bold letters identified what lay ahead as Long Road Cemetery. Vlad had no idea where the name had come from. There wasn't a long road in any part of Bathory, but he thought with a gulp, it certainly was an honest, if not somewhat morbid, name for a place where people bury their dead. Vlad took a deep breath, brushed his hair from his face with a shaking hand, and stepped forward into the cemetery with his eyes downcast. Nothing was worse than this pain. Not facing Diablo last year, not being attacked by Jasique, not being away from Otis, not running from Joss, not hiding from Eddie. Nothing. Halfway up the main path, Vlad paused to look around. The cemetery was overgrown with weeds and dead ivy and moss hung from the tree trunks. To his left stood a large block-shaped tombstone. Atop it sat a stone woman. In her hand was a wraith of some sort. In the moonlight, she seemed alive, and with a shiver, Vlad waited for her to move. To his immense relief, she didn't. To his right was a gravestone that looked like a book, and beside it, one topped with a statue in the shape of a small lamb. Moss had grown over the lamb's tiny nose, and in the moonlit darkness, it looked like some weird disease had befallen the animal. Vlad turned his head and saw the large, Tears welled in Vlad's eyes. He brushed them away with the back of his hand and took a slow, deep breath. People are stupid. Vlad bit his bottom lip gently and shook his head. It never gets easier, missing you. And sometimes I wonder if it ever will. A small animal raced out of the nearby woods and paused to chew some freshly sprouted clover. Vlad watched it for a moment in deep thought. He sat that way, mulling over the memory of the day he found them dead, going over all of the details he could recall of that horrible moment and the days after, until his feet had finally tingled with numbness, forcing him to sit on the ground. After what seemed like forever, he stood and brushed the grass and dirt from his jeans. He ran a caring hand over the top of the stone and let the tears come. They rolled down his cheeks in streams. I'm sorry I turned off your alarm. If there is any way I could take it back, I would. His shoulders shook as his silent tears gave way to painful sobs. After a while, he dried his face with his sleeve and took a few breaths, squelching his sadness for the moment. When he calmed himself down, he whispered, "But I can't, and I have to learn to live with that." Once he left the cemetery, he walked straight home, all the while trying not to think about his parents anymore. Instead, he focused on Jaws. Clearly, Vlad had to do something about his slayer friend, and avoiding Jaws or trusting him with his deepest secret was out of the question, so his options were pretty limited. It came down to two choices, and neither seemed very appealing. He could either stand up to Jaws, attacking first, getting the upper hand, and, with luck, scaring Jaws off for good, or he could manipulate Jaws by assisting in his search for the vampire battery. A few wrong turns initiated by Vlad might just be the trick to throw Jaws off the trail. But the idea of betraying a friend left a terrible taste in Vlad's mouth. What was that quote about keeping your friends close and your enemies closer? It didn't matter. It was good advice, all the same. Still, it came down to Vlad's life or his friendship with Jaws. The choice was pretty easy to make. Eddie was another complication altogether. Vlad moved between some houses and came out across the street from his old house, the one he'd lived in from the time he was a baby until he moved out to live with Nellie. He glanced back over his shoulder, completely baffled as to how he'd ended up here when he was sure he'd been heading straight home. The house looked so hollow in the moonlight, alone, empty. Vlad wondered if he'd ever lived there again. The house was legally his, the deed held by Nellie for him until he turned 18. Sometimes he daydreamed about fixing up the house and living there with a family of his own someday. Sometimes he wished it would just shrivel up and disappear, folding in on itself until it was no more. But then he'd remember some small detail about his parents, and the guilty tears would come, washing away all of those dark wishes and reminding him that there was a reason the house still stood. It was a symbol of his family, and even death couldn't take them from him. Across the street, a man was walking toward Vlad's old house. The man stopped and turned back. As if scanning the shadows for any sign he was being watched, Vlad ducked behind a tree, waited for a few seconds, and then dared a glance. Vlad knew that man. It was Jasik, the vampire who'd bitten him. Jasik stepped up to the porch, opened the door, and went inside. The door had only just latched before pause, then a sigh. I had thought Thomas's son might lead me to it, but clearly he has no knowledge of it, so there's no need to prolong his life any further. Jessica mumbled something that Vlad couldn't hear and then pushed a button and shoved the phone back into his pocket. With his bag in hand, he descended the stairs without a word. Vlad listened and heard the front door slam shut. He breathed a huge sigh of relief. Only temporary relief, though, because Jessica had been talking about killing him. it slid open with ease. Vlad made his way down the hall, and after a brief listen at the door, he stepped into the empty council room. He crossed the room and, straining his memory to recall which way the elevator was, opened another door, a crack. Jazik passed the door and stepped into the elevator. Vlad watched the numbers climb to 13 and stop. He moved to the elevator and pressed the up button. Lucky for him, the building was mostly empty. When the elevator came, he stepped inside. He touched his hand to a glyph in the wood, just as Uncle had done a year before, and the panel flipped open to reveal a second set of buttons. Vlad pressed 13 and waited. When the doors opened, Vlad stepped out and looked around for Jazik. At the end of the hall, 2 gloss black double doors stood open. Golden light poured from within. Vlad moved closer, sliding silently along the wall, and listened. So, a pause, then a small gasp. Excellent, Jazik. And the boy. Unharmed, as you instructed. Vlad held his breath and peered around the corner. Jazik was sitting in a chair near the large black desk. The other man was facing the window, clutching the vial of Vlad's blood in his hand. Neither had noticed Vlad's presence. The man by the window straightened his shoulders, but didn't tear his gaze from the view outside. Good. I want to be there to witness his demise. Jazik raised an eyebrow. I thought you believed him to be the prophet. The man grew quiet before answering in a soft, almost tranquil tone. I do. But I also must prove my belief to the world, remove all doubt, and to do so, I must take his life. Jazik snorted. And violate the highest law. Not at all. I've made other arrangements. You don't expect them to give me back my presidency after I've killed one of her own kind, do you? Of course not. Jazik's tone said that he wasn't exactly sure whether the man was a lawbreaker or not. So what if you're right, and he manages to survive death? The man turned around slowly. His black gloves shimmered in the low light. His long coat billowed as he moved. Black leather pants clung to his legs, but his chest was bare beneath the coat. Black gas with a large hole in the man's stomach. He had to place his hand over his mouth to contain the scream that threatened to boil up from within him. Diablo smirked at Jazik, and then he held the vial of blood up to the light. Then I want to be there to welcome him on bended knee. Vlad ducked out of sight, hands still clamped over his mouth. Diablo was alive. How was this possible? He remembered everything. The dark alley, the terrifying uncertainty as he pointed the Lucius at Diablo and ran his thumb over the cliff. Even Otis had said that they should just let him die. And die he had, right before Vlad's eyes. And yet the man in the next room was Diablo, with the same, though somewhat smaller, hole in his stomach. Vlad peeked around the corner again. Diablo had uncapped the vial of Vlad's blood and was sniffing the air above it, as a human would a fine wine. He lifted it a bit in a toasting gesture and opened his mouth as he tilted the open vial. Liquid ruby spilled from the container to Diablo's tongue. Diablo held the liquid in his mouth for a moment, apparently savoring the flavor. His head was tilted back slightly, his eyes closed. Vlad watched Diablo's Adam's apple rise and fall as his blood slipped down his throat. The office was completely silent, as if the very air feared to move. Vlad's heart drummed out a quick rhythm, pumping blood through his limbs, but his body was numb. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken. The sound was small at first, like an army of spiders moving in from far away, but it grew quickly, as if that army had started to run. Vlad watched, mesmerized, terrified, as the hole in Diablo's center began to move, to flex around the edges. A strand of tissue shot across the diameter of the hole, followed by another, and another, forming a strange web of flesh, accompanied by the now deafening spider sounds. The hole through Diablo was closing. Once it began, it moved very quickly. Strands gave way to muscle, muscle joined to form organs. Organs were covered with skin. The spider sounds died down, and Diablo was whole again. With carefully quiet movements, Vlad stood and slinked back down the hallway, almost knocking over a planter on his way out. It wobbled, but he steadied it and continued down the hall. Things couldn't get much first floor and staggered out the front door. He opened the door to the car and slid in beside Henry. Henry wrinkled his brow. Everything okay? Vlad shook his head once and then turned to the window, hoping Henry would take a hint and lay off. There was only one person Vlad wanted to talk to about Diablo's return, and he wasn't answering Vlad's letters. In the driver's seat, Greg chuckled. Women, they'll steer you wrong every time, Vlad. The ride home was silent, and but for the occasional nudge and worried glance from Henry, Vlad was left alone with his thoughts. He had no idea how Diablo had survived having the Lucius shoot a giant hole through his stomach, nor did he have any clue as to how Otis could have not known that Diablo survived. And what right did Vlad have to feel sickened by the sight of a vampire feeding on his blood when he feasted on human blood every day? Sometimes he felt like such a hypocrite. Vlad slumped down in his seat and watched the lights of the city disappear. Soon there was nothing to see but twinkling stars and wide open, dark places. When people had mentioned how difficult his freshman year would be, he had no idea how right they would be. Of course, they didn't have a vindictive, evil monster coming back from the dead and chasing after them, or a slayer who just happened to be one of his best friends. Vlad sighed. What was he going to do about Joss? He couldn't tell Joss the truth, couldn't risk exposing himself, not if Joss was carrying a wooden stake and garlic around with him. And now, with Diablo making plans to watch Vlad die, Bathory was about to become an enormously uncomfortable place for Vlad to live. Maybe he'd luck out and Joss would stumble upon Diablo before Diablo had a chance to reach Vlad. Vlad smirked at the thought and then furrowed his brow. That wasn't such a bad idea. If Joss killed Diablo, it would fix everything. Joss would be satisfied in his hunt for the local vampire. Diablo wouldn't be around to try to take Vlad's life, presuming, of course, that Diablo stayed dead this time, and Vlad wouldn't have to reveal his secret to Joss at all. All of his problems would be solved without the intervention of Otis. Greg turned on the radio. The Killers were on, singing a slow tune about how everything would be alright. Vlad leaned against the door and stared up at the stars, wishing against all odds that they were right. Alrighty guys, I'm going to stop there for tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and were able to relax, and possibly tingle a little bit. Tingle, 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 tingle a little bit. If this video piqued your interest at all, feel free to leave a like and a comment. I hope you guys have a good night. Have a good night. Sleep tight. Sleep tight. And as that saying